All right, good afternoon, everyone. Excited to have you here for today's Science-Based Targets and Net Zero webinar, hosted by the Supply Chain Sustainability School and presented by Natalie Duncan of WAP Sustainability. Love this session. I always find this to be a really interesting talk. Science-based targets are becoming almost like an industry standard for achieving your net zero strategy. So I'm thrilled that you're all here to learn more about it. I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping items, go through a few introductory pieces before we get started. So first and foremost, my name is Wendy Carradine. I am the operations manager for the Supply Chain Sustainability School here in the US. If you ever need any support or have any questions about the platform, about the Supply Chain School, about our resources or training program, please contact me and I would be more than happy to help you out. We have an hour booked for today's session. If you are in attendance today, you will receive a certificate of completion, and if you are a member of the school, that will appear automatically on your dashboard. If you are not yet a member, I would highly recommend that you sign up, and you can be awarded your certificate retroactively. So don't worry if you're not yet a member. There is a survey that we will circulate after this session. Would greatly appreciate it if you could just take 30 seconds, answer a couple of questions. It does really help us out in terms of setting the format and content for these sessions. So thank you in advance for doing that. We are recording today's session and the slides will also be circulated. So again, if you're in attendance today, you will be sent an email with a link to the slides and the recording. So you can not worry about taking notes right now. Just, immerse yourself in today's session and have a look at the resources that will be sent to you after today's session. There is a chat and QA function. Strongly recommend that you engage with us. You can drop a note in the chat box to say, where you're joining from, what organization you're with. We'd love to hear from you. If you do have any questions, we can answer them throughout. And there will also be time at the end for questions as well. So all of that said, I'm going to hand it back over to Natalie and we'll get started with today's session.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. So as Wendy mentioned, my name is Natalie Duncan, and I'll be presenting today on a topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds all the time, but maybe even more so today because there are a lot of changes happening in the way that companies are being asked to think about what science-based targets are. So we'll talk through some of the basics and fundamentals of science-based target setting. We'll talk a bit about net zero and also a little bit about carbon offsetting. And for today's presentation, you can call me Natalie Duncan. My name is often misspelled this way. It actually happened to me just this morning when I was calling to pick up a prescription. So if you're confused on why I'm bringing this up, it will make sense to you soon. So for a bit of an overview on today's workshop, there are kind of four main learning objectives that we'll address. So the first one is what makes a good emission reduction target and what makes a target science-based. So we'll look a little bit into how supply chain data in particular can support these science-based targets. And then we'll also have a brief discussion on how net zero differs from carbon neutral, as well as what good offsetting looks like, because these are all often topics that come up when companies are thinking about setting emission reduction targets, and it can be pretty confusing. Also, if you stick around to the end, we have some bonus information today about one of probably the biggest developments in science-based target setting today, which is the development of a version 2 of the current Science-Based Targets Initiative guidance on how to set emission reduction targets. We'll talk a little bit about this and I'll give some information on key changes, but as Wendy said in that follow-up survey, if this is a topic that would be relevant to you or of interest to you, it would be great to hear how we might be able to help. So let's start off with what makes a good emission reduction target. What are the hallmarks of a good target? This conversation today is actually going to be mostly about donuts. So I'm going to pose a question to you. What if I told you that I am committing to eat 50% less donuts? I'm getting married in 3 weeks, so I've made this commitment. I'm eating 50% less donuts. Your first reaction might be, great, that commitment is great. It will likely improve your health. Everyone should commit to eating 50% less donuts. But what you'll learn today is that this target that I've just talked about is missing key pieces of information for you to be able to really understand if this is a good commitment. A better way to describe the target that I'm committing to would look like this. I am committing to eating X% less donuts over a certain time frame, maybe the next year, from a baseline of X, a certain amount of donuts. The first key element of this target is how many donuts are you eating today? I think if I told you I was eating 20 donuts a day and that I was committing to eat 50% less, you might look at me a little strange, as opposed to I'm eating 5 donuts a month and I'm committing to reduce that by 50%. You also might want to know, well, what reduction in donuts does your doctor recommend? Maybe my doctor thinks I need to reduce my donut consumption by 90% because I'm eating a lot of them. We don't really know how healthy a 50% reduction is without this type of information. And then lastly, we come back to the question of time frame. Am I reducing my donut intake over a month? Am I going to try to get there over the next year or 2 years? This is important information in order to know how long is my commitment going to last and also how quickly do I plan to reach my target. So this is definitely kind of a silly example, but I'm going to try to use the consumption of donuts as an example throughout this presentation to help teach you about science-based targets. And what we learned here is there are really three components of a good emissions reduction target. The percent reduction should be informed by scientific consensus. The emission reduction target should state the target year, the time frame in which I aim to achieve the target. And it should also have a stated baseline against which we're able to measure progress and make sure I'm actually achieving what I set out to do. What this looks like in terms of emissions instead of donuts often looks like this. Company X commits to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions X% by 20X from a base year of 20X. This is a really common target outline for how companies are structuring and communicating their emission reduction ambitions. And I pulled an example here. It's publicly available. This is online just to show you what this looks like in real life. So this is part of a building product company's near-term commitment, which says the company commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions 30% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. This is how they tend to look. As part of kind of the three components of a good emission reduction target, I brought up this concept of the percent reduction being informed by science. So let's dig a bit further into what makes a target science-based. A science-based target aims to reduce emissions in line with what the latest climate science deems is necessary in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, that being to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And there may be some listeners on the call today who might follow climate talk a bit more closely, and you might be asking, haven't we already surpassed 1.5 degrees C of warming? And yes, actually, the consensus is we're already in this territory of dangerous levels of warming. But this remains the goal of the Paris Agreement with the hope of kind of bending the curve on temperature rise. And if you're interested in learning more about the science behind this, there is actually another webinar on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School webpage for an introduction to climate and carbon. One way to think about what climate scientists deem necessary to keep emissions under a certain level is to visualize these reductions on a path from today towards the future. So if we come back to this donut analogy, we can measure the number of donuts that are eaten today by the global population. And in order to stay healthy, doctors say that the global population should reduce the amount of donuts eaten by a certain amount over time towards zero. A science-based target that's formulated for the near term, when we say this is a near-term target, that's usually 5 to 10 years out from the year that it's set. So this gives us kind of a midway point to understand our progress towards a healthier level of consumption of donuts. In this longer term, so same chart just extended over a longer period, climate scientists consider this long-term time to be around 2050. And at this time, we will have reduced our donut consumption but there will still be some level of donut consumption that will happen beyond 2050. Some donuts are still going to be eaten. But going forward, when we reach this level of what we call residual donut consumption, we can offset the amount of donuts by eating an equivalent amount of broccoli. So let's swap out donut consumption with greenhouse gas emissions production. So similarly, global emissions production should reduce over time to a residual level of emissions beyond 2050. And after that, these residual emissions are offset by capturing and then storing an equal amount of emissions. So this begins to introduce the concept of carbon offsets, which will be required on these longer term timescales when we reach residual emissions levels. Climate scientists and doctors agree that it's basically hard or near impossible to get the global population to eat zero donuts or produce zero emissions. So, no matter what you think about broccoli, we're still going to need some form of offsetting tool in that longer term time period. It's definitely a tricky topic, which we're going to address again in a little more detail nearer to the end of this presentation. One of the challenges of climate science is that the climate is a global system, so it spans the entire globe. So we need to find a way to translate our understanding of what's needed in terms of global emission reduction to the reductions that need to happen at the industry level and all the way down to an individual company scale. This is really challenging, but thankfully we have the Science Based Targets Initiative. So they're an organization whose whole mission it is to define these global emission reduction targets and what climate scientists are saying down to the level of individual companies. In practice, if we come back to the donut analogy, SBTI gives guidance to determine how many donuts each person or industry eats today and what's a reasonable reduction pathway going forward toward 2050. As you can imagine, and maybe from your own personal experience, different people eat a different amount of donuts and have a more or less feasible path to reducing that number to something that's healthy. A person with a, let's just say, higher natural metabolism than another person may be able to healthfully eat more donuts. There may also be a couple of different people who all have a similar natural rate of metabolism, who are all eating right now a different number of donuts. But doctors have mapped a path for each of these people to all converge to eat the same amount of donuts that's healthy for this group based on their specific metabolism. In the world of emissions, different industries might have different required or feasible rates of reduction, and different companies within one industry might all be starting at different emission levels, but they all need to converge to the same target level of emissions over time. Based on what climate science and SBTI have deemed to be each industry's emission budget, SBTI then quantified a general kind of percent reduction plan that's applicable for most companies. So the science-based reduction for most companies is 4.2% linear annual reduction in scope 1 and 2, and a 2.5%, little lower, a 2.5% linear annual reduction in scope 3. Some high-emitting industries, or we can think like some people who particularly love donuts and are eating a lot of them, have individual guidance to transition towards lower emissions over time. So SBTI does have industry-specific guidance that kind of supplements these general percent reduction plans I just talked about. In addition, SBTI outlines some other specific requirements for companies to set and achieve their targets. I'm not going to go into the details here. You'll have this deck for after the presentation. But in general, just know that you're required to formulate your target in a way that's consistent between other companies so that the ambition and the progress you're making toward your target can be compared. And it allows companies to be held accountable for progress on their emission reduction targets if we're all doing it the same way. There is an important lesson within what we're talking about, which is that the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, does not equal science-based targets. And what I mean by this is a target can be science-based without being validated by the SBTI. However, SBTI does help companies through publicly available guidance to set and validate their targets to ensure they are indeed science-based. The reason I bring this up is it kind of reveals the true value of third-party verification or validation. So SBTI as a term now means something in the market. Companies may be asked to have SBTI validated targets because there is a certain amount of value in having an independent third party sign off on your target. Just kind of making sure it matches the criteria that makes your target aligned to the best available climate science. But again, your target can be science based without having gone through that validation phase from SBTI. SBTI is also not the only organization that's available to help companies set emission reduction targets. There are a number of different ones on the market right now. We have the Climate Pledge, Exponential Roadmap. There's also forthcoming guidance from ISO on net zero. And the British Standards Institute also has a standard on carbon neutrality, which is different from net zero. And we'll talk about that in a future slide. But in general, SBTI has kind of risen to the top in terms of adoption and acceptance in the market. Now I kind of want to discuss how supply chain data can be used to support target achievement. Before we do that, I want to give an example of a typical manufacturer's emission profile. So this is an example of a tier one contractor, and the chart on the left shows the company's direct or operational emissions. So the fuel they burn on site, the things they have control over. But when we zoom out to include its supply chain emissions, the operational emissions are often only 1 to 5% of the total emissions picture. The rest of it is supply chain emissions. So engagement and collaboration within the supply chain is really critical in order for companies to be able to achieve their emission reduction targets. So when beginning to address supply chain emissions, the first step that companies often take is to measure their baseline. If you remember, this slide outlined the three components of an emission reduction target, and a key step is having a stated baseline against which you can measure your progress. So let's look into how supply chain emissions can be baselined and measured. In order to establish your baseline, we need to go back to the basics, and for that we're bringing back the donuts, but we're going to bring it back in a slightly different way this time. Now we are role playing as a donut manufacturer. We're making donuts. And the first thing I need to do is I need to take an inventory of my operations. So what am I buying to run my business at all of my donut plants? And companies are doing this every year to conduct their baseline inventories. They're looking at all their activities within a year, and they're looking to measure the impact of these activities. So in the world of donuts, you could think about the measure of these different ingredients in terms of calories. That's like the impact of the ingredients. So we know that maybe flour in the donut contributes 8 total calories, whereas yeast is like 1, sugar is 7 calories, so on, so on. So in total, based on what the donut is made of, the donut contains 26 calories. I think this is probably a mini donut, if I had to guess. We can then map out the ingredients we just measured based on their contribution to the total calories within the donut. Now we're going to say I'm a particular type of donut manufacturer. I'm a donut maker that's trying to reduce the calories in my donut to as close to zero as possible. So I started by knowing what's contributing the most to my donut's calorie profile. So I'm going to think about, once I know what my donut is made of, what is contributing the most and how may I be able to reduce the calories within the donut. It's the same exercise we would go through to measure baseline greenhouse gas emissions. What materials do you buy? What's the environmental impact of each material and how do we reduce? So companies who have these emission reduction targets use this information to make decisions about where to begin engaging their suppliers. From my measurement, I know that sugar and flour contribute the most to the total calories. So it's like 58% of the calories in my mini donut are from these two ingredients. So we can consider these as our hotspots where we should begin focusing our attention. Let's restate the donut manufacturing example into the language of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can say that from our inventory work, we know that the majority of emissions come from two raw materials, sugar and enriched wheat flour. In order to reduce the emissions, we need to engage the suppliers that supply these raw materials to us. And there are two goals with this engagement. First, we want to collect primary data on raw material emissions from those suppliers. So for this, we would need to ask the supplier for the actual emissions they've measured, which will allow us to replace the estimates that we've made. So this is a little different from calories because it's pretty standard to report calories per ingredient, but it's not standard right now to report emissions per ingredient. So we often need to make estimates and we want to clean these up to be sure we're targeting the right hotspots. That's our first goal, get that primary data. The second goal is that we want to be able to track raw material emissions over time to ensure that our suppliers are also working to reduce their emissions and that we're able to document and report this every year. Having a good handle on this question of where my hot spots for emissions are and what is the primary emissions data for these raw materials, how are the emissions of these raw materials changing over time, having a good handle on all of this allows companies to track their emission reduction efforts that are happening upstream or sometimes downstream of their operations and are really outside of their control. It also allows companies to, in theory, begin prioritize buying from suppliers who are also tracking and trying to reduce their impact over time. And we're seeing this happen in the procurement landscape more and more, this kind of prioritized buying or preferred supplier selection based on who is tracking and reducing their impact. So I put on screen just a couple of the commonly used methods to collect supply chain sustainability data. If you have big customers, a lot of these might already look familiar to you. So one of the big ones, probably most familiar, is EcoVadis. This asks suppliers to provide information about the company's ESG efforts and their progress. Similarly, there's an annual questionnaire called CDP. This also asks about company performance on sustainability issues. Another example is PACT aligned data to share with customers. This refers to kind of product level emissions information, just like the calories of the ingredient or the PACT aligned carbon footprint of an ingredient. So again, this is just another way for suppliers to report a baseline so that customers are then able to measure and track progress. There's obviously a lot more to say on this topic of sharing data, but for future discussions on this role of how supply chain data sharing works in achieving sustainability objectives, again, highly recommend staying up to date with the training resources that are available on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School website. That's kind of the best place to go. I want to step back briefly just to talk about this concept of net zero and how it differs from carbon neutral. So, we've been talking up until now about what it takes for emission reduction targets to be science-based to achieve net zero ambition. But we haven't talked yet about this concept of carbon neutral. So, I'm going to lay that out a bit more explicitly. Carbon neutral and net zero are similar, but they do have really important differences. Carbon neutral usually only focuses on one type of greenhouse gas, and it's in the name, carbon, whereas net zero covers all types of greenhouse gases. Carbon neutral generally focuses on operational neutrality, usually only scope 1 and 2, whereas net zero almost always covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. Carbon neutral doesn't have a defined ambition for carbon reduction over time, whereas net zero ambition is usually aligned with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is the leading scientific body on climate change. Carbon neutral also allows for offsetting. And that's actually part of the reason why there's not a defined ambition for reduction over time, because at any point along this reduction pathway, carbon neutral allows for an equal amount of offsetting to occur, whereas net zero doesn't allow for any offsetting except in that longer term when there are those residual emissions that we talked about. And I want to really zoom in on this last point because this is the key differentiator between carbon neutral and net zero. So if we come back to our beautiful graphic of donuts and broccoli, this graphic from earlier in the presentation was about net zero targets. So we brought up this concept of residual donut consumption, and this reflects the understanding that it's probably not possible to get donut consumption or emissions production or anything really down to zero, absolute zero. There will always be some sort of residual something. So in net zero, beyond a certain time frame, the offsetting of these residual emissions is allowed. Versus for carbon neutral, there's an equivalent amount of broccoli being eaten at any of the interim years up to 2050 and beyond. This actually gives you the ability then to claim carbon neutrality in any year. So you can say, my company produces carbon neutral products, or my company's operations were carbon neutral in 2025. Whereas for net zero, your claims will likely sound something more like, we have a target to achieve net zero by a certain date, or we're on the path to net zero. So it sounds a little bit different, and the type of communication that's allowed also creates different reactions in the marketplace. Again, broccoli is offsetting. The conversation around carbon offsets can be really tricky because it can feel like by me just eating some additional broccoli, how does that actually have an impact on the fact that I'm still eating some donuts? Taken in the language of carbon emissions, I may be trying to capture some carbon by planting trees or saving a forest from being cut down, but I'm still pumping emissions into the atmosphere. So, how does that work? Climate scientists actually agree that there is a role for carbon removals to be used to reach net zero by 2050. Again, this comes back to the concept of zero is a very hard and absolute number. And we know that zero is not realistic. There's always going to be some level of residual emissions. So there's an understanding that some amount of carbon removal, carbon offsetting is needed. The tricky thing is that many of these technologies are novel. So if we wait too long to develop these technologies, the cost is going to remain really high. But if we start to allow companies to purchase carbon offsets and support the development of these new technologies, we may be allowing companies to compensate too early. And well, we're also not really entirely sure how effective these carbon technologies might be. So we might be creating a really bad situation by disincentivizing actual emission reductions and allowing offsetting on the path to net zero. So it's a hard balance. I did just want to show a little graphic on how carbon offsets work because I think it helps clarify. The concept is that carbon offsets should be used as a supplement to your own emissions reduction efforts. So you're reducing your own emissions down to some residual level. Then you put money towards some sort of scheme or offset project, and you're investing in that project to help someone else reduce their emissions or remove emissions from the atmosphere. So by investing in that project, you've created the ability to reduce the amount of emissions that that project would have emitted, and you can claim credit for that amount of reduced emissions. And this amount should be the same as your residual emissions amount. So together, your residual emissions and the credits you've bought for the avoidance or removal of emissions are the same. And that's how you reach zero. I think this can be pretty complicated, but if you take anything from the discussion, it's that there is a role for some sort of offset or removal scheme, and there's a balance to be struck between waiting too long or also allowing the use of credits too soon. I think learning a bit more about the fundamentals of carbon offsetting can also help us understand kind of what best practices are considered to be in the market, which can help us know if we're moving in the right direction. So for that, I think it's worth taking a little time to look into, well, what does good offsetting look like? First, we need to clean up our terminology a little bit. So, carbon offsets are generated when an activity removes or reduces carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. These offsets are then reported and verified, usually by a verification body. And then this verification body issues an associated number of carbon credits. However, not all carbon credits are created equal. Broccoli is not the same as broccoli, is not the same as broccoli. One of the things that makes carbon credits different is their origin story, or the type of project that created the offset in the first place. When we think about types of projects, we can categorize these into two broad categories of carbon offsetting projects: avoid and reduce, and removal projects. The avoid and reduce projects will mostly be familiar. It includes things like the generation of certain types of renewable energy, nature-based solutions like avoiding deforestation. We can also think about things like efficient appliances and cooking stove replacements as other ways to reduce carbon emissions. On the removal side of things, reforestation might be familiar. So, growing more trees captures more carbon from the atmosphere, literally removes it from the atmosphere. And then we also have technological carbon capture and storage technologies. Right now, the avoid and reduce projects make up about 80% of the available credits, whereas carbon removal projects is less common, closer to around 20%. I do want to dig a bit deeper into these removal projects because it is newer and it's in the middle of really a huge level of growth and expansion. I also want to note before I give some examples of these carbon removal projects that these techniques typically involve the removal and also the durable storage of the emissions that are captured, which is really critical for the long-term decrease in atmospheric emissions, which is what we're aiming for in order to keep temperatures at a hospitable level for humans. These carbon removal technologies are really interesting, and there's a whole world of scientific study right now around the actual capture and removal of carbon. But for now, I just want to give three pretty cool examples. The first one is direct air capture. This sucks carbon dioxide right out of the air, and after it catches the carbon, you can then shoot the carbon underground, or you can use it to sell to soda companies or building materials companies who then pump the carbon into their products and temporarily, at least, store the carbon that way. The second example is enhanced rock weathering. This may be a little bit less familiar, but the concept here is that you sprinkle special crushed rocks on the ground, or also could happen on a farmer's field, and also serve as fertilizer. And when the rain falls on the rocks, it helps capture the carbon dioxide from the air. The carbon then travels via the water flow into the ground and basically speeds up the natural rock weathering process, which is the natural carbon cycle of the Earth. And then the third is microalgae farming. So there are companies that are growing these giant farms of microalgae with the sole intention of harvesting it and burying it in the Sahara Desert. That is an actual company proposition and technology happening today, a real screenshot from a real farm. The concept here is that microalgae doesn't need much to grow. It needs water, some nutrients, and sun, and it captures a lot of carbon in its growth process, a huge amount of carbon per weight of algae. So you're creating these little like carbon capture machines, and then you bury them, again, with the aim of enhancing the Earth's natural carbon cycle. If we think about all of the world's atmospheric greenhouse gases as being contained in a bathtub, we can think about these avoid and reduce projects as basically just turning down the tap, so putting less emissions into the atmosphere. In contrast, the removal credits are equivalent to basically unplugging the drain and removing the carbon that's already in the tub. I think this can be kind of a helpful, simple way of thinking about these two different forms of offset projects. If we look a little bit into offset costs, your question might be, what does this actually look like for a company looking to purchase credits like this today? There's really a very wide range just based on maturity, feasibility, technological readiness. On the lower cost side of the scale, we have things like renewable energy generation, cook stove projects, reforestation programs can be down there as well. Like, these are just indicative. It's not meant to be anything solid, but just kind of give you a sense of the span of pricing today. We can think of $100 a ton as kind of a helpful benchmark. So the European Union actually has its own compliance-based, so regulated, required emission trading scheme where they're selling credits based on their kind of carbon trading system in the union. In 2023, I think that price hit $100 a ton. I just saw the quarter one average was more like 80 something dollars per ton. These credits aren't generated from one specific type of project. They're generated from the amount of emissions from industry in the European Union. But I think it's a helpful benchmark for the value that we're placing on the avoidance of carbon these days, or, the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. And then on the upper end of the scale, carbon offsets can cost much over $1,000 per ton. These are usually the more novel removal technologies, and they tend to be highly expensive just because they're at the startup scale. But of course, that number is expected to reduce over time with investment and maturity. I want to come back to this concept though of, well, how do we know what makes a good offset project? And the default answer to this is that in order to be robust, the offsetting project really needs to have these four characteristics. It needs to be real, verifiable, and traceable. And I should be able to go out into the forest. So we're on this like real, this first element needs to be verifiable, traceable. Like I can go to the forest and say, yes, that's real, you're growing trees, you're doing what you said you were going to do. It also needs to be additional, this second bullet point. Additionality is a key concept in carbon offsetting, and it refers to the fact that without additional financing through the sale of the credits, this project would have never happened. So the project has to only be possible with the additional flow of money from companies who are ultimately going to offtake the offset credits. This is important because some of the offset project types that I mentioned, like the renewable energy projects, are now reaching a point beyond additionality. In some cases, renewable energy is so cost effective that the developer doesn't need to make money from the sale of offset credits to make it work. So many of these renewable energy credits are moot. They're no longer eligible to generate offset credits. It's business as usual, basically. The third point is the project needs to be measurable. So you actually need to be able to confirm what the business as usual baseline carbon emissions would be and compare against the baseline where you've avoided a certain tonnage of carbon. And then the last characteristic is it needs to be permanent. And the question of permanence is interesting in terms of what scale are we talking about? What scale of permanence is this? Is it something you can confirm is permanent for human lifespan, for longer? So there are different ways of thinking about what permanence means for different project types. So in general, this RAMP acronym defines what a robust offsetting project looks like. And these RAMP criteria are confirmed to be true by different verifying bodies. These verifying bodies should be independent, transparent, have robust governance. They are really there to help avoid double counting, which means they've set up an accurate kind of like register of carbon offsetting projects, and they're keeping track of the offsets that are generated from the projects and who has claimed them so that two companies can't make the same claim on the same project. And I've listed here three of the more well-known offset verification bodies: Verra, Gold Standard, the American Carbon Registry. There are a few others as well. And as a company who's interested in purchasing carbon offsets, you would usually work with a broker who would be like a third party in between you and these verifying bodies to be able to identify projects and then retire the offsets in your name. when I introduced this slide, I did mention that this is kind of the default that people go to when defining good offsetting. But even offset projects that have met this robustness criteria and have been verified have come under scrutiny. So I just snapped a couple of headlines from the last few years. Some of this is saying that certain carbon offsets are not actually additional, like we talked about, or didn't produce the benefits that they said they would. We saw a case where some areas of forest were destroyed by forest fires, and companies like Microsoft and BP had invested in the protection of those forests in order to demonstrate the avoidance of carbon that would have been emitted by logging. So, carbon offsets up in smoke, very intense headline. That is kind of the world of offsetting that we're in right now. In order to address this scrutiny and the genuinely real problems that exist with offsetting, there is a revitalized movement to define good offsetting practices. And it's centered around this concept of high integrity projects. That's kind of the new thing. We did see some federal guidelines that emerged from the Biden administration that are kind of on the back burner. The European Union has also gone forward with setting some guidelines for offsetting. And we're seeing recommendations from this certain voluntary disclosure organizations like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market. So these have kind of risen to the top in response to scrutiny we're seeing from carbon offsets. And there's definitely more to come on this front. So, what does all this mean for good offsetting practices today? We know that offsetting should be secondary to direct reduction, but at the same time, that climate scientists have told us and agree that some amount of carbon removal is needed. So it should be secondary, but maybe not exclusive of offsetting. We also know that different project types have unique pros and cons. So if you avoid logging a forest and it goes up in flames, that's a unique consideration and scenario compared to the risks of getting involved in super expensive startup scale direct air capture, for example. There is awareness that should be placed on this emerging guidance related to the concept of high integrity credits. Hopefully, this will help guide companies a little better in making purchasing decisions, but at the end of the day, this is a developing field and the concept of good is still really being fully defined.
I think that actually ties in really well with a question we've just received from Dennis, Natalie. Dennis asks, SBTIs are great and they really do a lot of work, but he's asking how often are they updated because they're not the silver bullet, they're not completing all of the work, they're not taking us over that finish line. So yeah, his question is. These efforts look primarily at emissions, and temperatures are getting worse than expected and more quickly. How often are the work forecasts updated, and do they address unintended consequences of other sustainability, the SDGs, as the science is only based on what we know? I think that's a really interesting question because, yeah, there is always going to be something that comes from actions that we take that were not always accounted for.
Yes, yes, there's a lot in that question, actually.
It's it's
Um,
it's it's a chunk, yeah.
it's a really good one, and the first kind of thing that stood out to me was how often are these things updated? And actually, in just a couple of slides, I'll talk a little bit about a very important update that's happening at SBTI right now. But I think also baked into that question was, climate science is not a perfect science. So even our understanding of what the level of emissions in the atmosphere is, there are obviously direct measurements we can take. But in terms of creating a carbon budget and forecasting that into the future and the dynamics that are relevant in our climate system, those create a lot of uncertainty. So there's no perfection in that, especially when it comes to projecting into the future. I think that the question on trade-offs is also important. One thing that has been a positive about SBTI and the adoption in the market is that it's put more focus on emission reduction. Have we always done it in the right way? Have we always invested in the right projects and considered the trade-offs? Absolutely not. But yeah, I think to some extent, companies, at least the perspective of companies, is not letting perfect be the enemy of good. and making progress. I think that I'll leave it at that at risk of undersimplifying a really good question. So let's kind of talk about a brief summary of what we learned, and then I want to get to that other question about updates that are happening right now in the market. Just kind of summarizing everything we talked about, one of the biggest takeaways here is that there are three components of a good emission reduction target, which lead you to the clear actions that you need to take in order to formulate a target that you can feel good about. The first one is that you need to measure your baseline. So this will allow you to know where you're starting from and measure progress over time. The next is to use SBTi's guidance to help understand what percent reduction is needed as informed by climate science. And then lastly, set your target year and begin reducing emissions and tracking emissions year over year. This will more than likely require engaging your supply chain because you can't do it alone, but this is the ambition that we're aiming towards and the motivation to begin the journey, begin the process. And there was actually one more lesson from what we learned to complement the three components of a good emission reduction target, which is that offsetting can be used as a supplemental action, but not as a replacement for reductions. So I promised at the top of the call, and we just had this question about, how often are these things updated and what are the current changes happening in the market? So before I kind of pass it back to Wendy to wrap up and answer any questions, at the time of recording this, we're actually in the middle of SBTi's development of version 2 of their guidance. And if you're interested, you can read the draft version 2. It's currently being reviewed and revised before final publication, and we expect it to be published sometime this year. So this is definitely something to be on the watch for if you're considering setting targets. And kind of the updates that are proposed in SBTi are fairly technical in nature. And I think that a lot of these summaries about the proposed changes can start to get really detailed really fast. But I'd like to try at least to share just kind of a high level view of some of the major changes to SBTi's approach. I'll try and do it in as plain terms as possible to kind of help us understand. So overall, SBTi is moving away from this concept of a predefined percent reduction in scope 1, 2, and 3. And they're moving toward the idea of setting targets based on what are called net zero aligned benchmarks. And I think potentially one of the questions raised around how often are these things updated and the fact that climate science is imperfect and hard means that if we are able to move further away from actual just like percent emission reduction over time, but instead focus more on encouraging investment into lower carbon alternatives, that could be kind of a winning formula. So that's potentially part of SBTi's hypothesis in some of the changes they're trying to make. So what does this mean, these net zero aligned benchmarks or investment into low carbon alternatives? What does that mean in practice? So when we look at scope 1, the proposed changes say that your target should depend on the source of your emissions. So for example, if you make steel, your scope 1 operational emissions need to decrease along the SBTi steel sector pathway. If you use fuel for heat or for transportation, you need to increase the percent of low carbon fuel for heating, again, along this kind of defined emissions intensity reduction pathway, with the idea that you're consuming the same amount of fuel or more, but it has lower impact because you're investing in these low carbon fuel alternatives. When we look at scope 2, the proposal is that your target should be based on the percent of renewable electricity you purchase towards this benchmark number of 0.001 kilograms CO2e per kilowatt hour, just basically a low carbon alternative or zero carbon alternative by 2040 based on this SBTi power sector pathway. So you can still use RECs, that's one important caveat, but you would need to disclose the percent of purchased low carbon electricity versus the percent of attributes or credits that you purchased. So you need to be a bit more specific. Again, SBTI saying, where's your money going towards? Is it going towards credits or is it going toward actual physical grid decarbonization for the supply that's being pumped into your site? And when we look at scope three, again, the main focus here is progressing towards these reference emissions intensity benchmarks for each relevant emission source. So buying maybe the same thing, but the lower carbon alternative. The intent is to drive outcomes and financing towards net zero instead of prescribing perhaps an emission reduction yourself, although that's part of the target as well. But again, more focused on what you're buying and how much of what you're buying is the low carbon version. So, for example, in scope three, this average emissions intensity of your downstream transportation has to meet certain benchmarks for each relevant transportation mode. So, there's a air reduction pathway, there's a truck reduction pathway, there's a car reduction pathway, and you are buying the lower carbon transportation version. We can similarly think about this with the average emissions intensity of purchased commodities that you buy, like steel or cement. These also have to meet certain intensity benchmarks. So, again, I'm going to repeat my statement at risk of oversimplifying something that's very complicated. I think taking away from this the idea that SBTI is focused a lot more in its proposal for what version 2 could look like on where you're putting your money and if that money is being put towards lower carbon alternatives rather than trying to track an emission reduction overall. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to say. I'm really happy to take questions. And again, if this is a topic of interest on what's changing in version 2, please let us know. But just to wrap up, a reminder that we looked at what does it take to make a good emission reduction target, what makes it science-based, how does supply chain data support target achievement, how does net zero differ from carbon neutral, and then we looked at what good offsetting looks like. So thank you so much. My contact information is here if you have any questions, and I hope you agree and understand I should be called Natalie Duncan. Thank you.
I know I say this at the end of every session, but it's just like, no, I gotta go get a donut. Like,
I know, I'm sorry.
so we do have one more question again from Dennis. If a Scope 3 supplier serves various large manufacturers, this is a great question, and these manufacturers have different net zero benchmarks, what advice would you suggest for the Scope 3 provider? Great question, Dennis.
Yeah, I think a lot of those details are what SBTI is currently trying to reconcile in this version 2. It's not finalized yet. It's in its expert working groups and revision, and it'll be interesting to see how they handle questions like that. Um, yeah, I guess I don't have a strong answer except that if you are in one of the commodity industries I mentioned, like steel, cement, chemicals, transportation, power, um, there's some around buildings, but less so right now. If any of those are relevant to you, I would recommend looking at the SBTI sector guidance because they do have these net zero benchmarks, at least how they're thinking about it. Now, will the market all adopt and align perfectly? Definitely not.
Wouldn't that be a
So,
dream?
yeah, it's a good question though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data collection, I know it can be an absolute nightmare for a lot of organizations, particularly like, it doesn't matter if you're small or you're massive, and there's pros and cons to both, but is having a robust data collection system set up, I think is always just a great place to start. If you can't measure, you can't manage it. So yeah, I think that's always going to be what I boil things down to. So.
I think it's a great point. And Dennis, I don't know what industry you're in, but to Wendy's point there around being able to first measure and communicate the emissions impact of whatever product or service you're selling, at least helps you have a baseline conversation with the customer to say, I don't know how you're thinking about low carbon or what transitioning to net zero looks like. they probably don't fully know, to be honest. But saying, here's what I'm bringing to the table, this is
Exactly.
my measurement. Where
Mhm.
can we go from here? There's a lot of openness to conversation, at least from my experience in certain industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And this conversation can spiral into EPDs and LCA and carbon reporting and all sorts of other things that the school can also provide training on. But yeah, just something that it's related but not related. I was thinking about this just before today's session. Amazon Web Services released they opened up their dashboard for sustainability tracking today, and I thought that that was really interesting that they're opening it up to pretty much anyone without requiring strict IT permissions. But yeah, and now I think anybody who uses the AWS servers can now go into a console and see what kind of carbon emissions are associated with their service. So you can actually break down your scope one, two, and three emissions, which I thought was kind of cool. Going off on a tangent, so
No, no.
apologies.
It's actually not a tangent. It's spot on because what you're picking up is that, what you know well is that the market is demanding information about emissions of products and services, and the ability to communicate is a critical differentiator for companies today, given the expectations on them from not only customers, but investors and more the public, although it's a little bit more ebbs and flows, maybe with interest,
Mhm.
or other factors. But yeah, it is a critical competitive differentiator for companies to be able to communicate about their products in that way. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if there are any other questions, and we didn't get to them in the chat, feel free to reach out to either Natalie, who's kindly put her contact details up on the screen here. They're also in the slide deck that's being circulated after this event, or reach out to the school. My contact details are info@supplychainschool.com. You're probably receiving emails from me already. Let's be honest, you're probably getting spammed. But if you do have any questions, like I said, I encourage you to reach out and we'll make sure that your question gets back to Natalie or any of our other subject matter experts. Just a quick reminder that the email will be going out from myself tomorrow, just with the links to the slides and the recording, as well as a couple other resources that I think that you guys might find useful. I would also encourage you to check out the energy and carbon section of resources in the resource library of the Supply Chain School. It's all free. It's all there at your fingertips, and it's there to be used. So, with all of that said, I'm going to thank all of you for being here for today's session. Thank you to Natalie for another great talk, wonderful presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope to see you all at a future session. So, thank you very much. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.